The devil's dice. I found the rosewood box in an estate sale. The building itself was a dilapidated old home at the edge of town that had been reclaimed by the bank. Something I was sure was going to happen to me, to be honest. I had been struggling financially after being laid off. I'd heard you can find some valuable treasures to wrestle at these events, and so there I was, pawing the curious box in my hands. It was locked, and there was no key. Just a rattle from inside. "How much?" I asked the man working the sales table by the door. He held up all 10 of his stubby fingers. I was sure nothing of value was inside, but the wooden box might get me $50 online. I walked over and handed him a 5, 4 ones and 4 quarters. Everything else of possible value had clearly been picked off, so I sighed, trudged back to my car and drove back with my new mystery box. When I got home, I went online to research how to pick open old locks. It didn't take long before I found some tutorials that showed how to do it with only a bobby pin. I soon went to work on the brass tumbler. It took about 15 minutes of fiddling before I heard the mechanism click and the box snapped open. Inside was a pair of dice. They looked old, made of perhaps an ivory that had lost its luster. Upon further inspection, I determined they had to have been made of carved bone. I picked them up, surprised by how smooth they were, aside from the indented, blood red dots. I gave the die roll onto my coffee table, hearing their satisfying rattle. A 1 and a 2 landed face up, giving me a 3. They had a nice feel and weight to them. Maybe they were worth something. Hopefully, the box would be at least. I went to bed that night with a glimmer of hope that they'd fetch me some money. I sleep face down, mind you, with my right hand under my pillow and right cheek flat against that. When I rustled from whatever unpleasant dream awoke me, I felt something touch my hand. Something moving. I yelped and quickly sprang up. I lifted up the pillow and yelled at the sight of what was there. There were 3 human teeth beneath my pillow, brown with rot and crawling with tiny black beetles reminiscent of pill bugs. I later learned they were carrion beetle larvae. At the time I was far more concerned with how they got there. I probed my teeth with my tongue, finding none missing, but rushed to the bathroom mirror anyways. I opened my mouth to find every molar and bicuspid in place. They were not my teeth. Questions as to how they got in there stirred and uneasiness grew. Did someone break into my house and do this? How could they have gotten in? I raced around my apartment checking the windows and front door. All were locked. There was no sign of any intruder. I fetched a dustpan and swept up the stained teeth, as well as the tiny clambering insects. I tossed the teeth in the trash and dumped the beetles out the window before locking it once again. I then walked into the living room and saw the coffee table and the 2 dice glaring up at me with those 3 red markings. The same number of teeth I'd found under my pillow. As the day progressed, I eventually began to calm down. I went about my day, applying for jobs and deferring payments as best I could. When I left to check my mailbox, however, I stared in disbelief. 3 crisp $100 bills were in my mailbox, no envelope or explanation. It was impossible to ignore. I'd rolled 3, and I'd found 3 teeth and $300. I need to emphasize here the fact that I'm a skeptic to the bone. I do not believe in anything supernatural. I expected this to be some kind of elaborate prank of sorts. Still, I needed that $300 at that moment. I pocketed the cash and returned indoors to the 2 dice on the table. I picked them up again. I shook the die, feeling their weight as they rattled in my hands, before rolling them onto the coffee table. When they came to a stop, each displayed 3 diagonal blood red eyes. 6. Paranoia set in, and I scoured the dark shadows of my apartment. I looked under the table. I sensed a coldness and emptiness. I felt an uneasiness in my stomach like something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put a finger on it. Nothing happened, however, and the hours passed until the day was done. That night, I checked my place thoroughly, searching under my pillows and in every nook and cranny. I made sure the locks on the doors and windows were secure, and I eventually drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, I felt something wet and sticky on my hand. I lifted the pillow to see 6 bloody teeth, each with twining roots clinging to congealed red pulps of gum and dried blood. I screamed and quickly got up, while contemplating what to do about the gore-strewn horror staining my bed. I could call the police, but what would I say? Some deranged tooth fairy was being summoned by a pair of dice. That I found money that they would most likely confiscate as evidence and pull teeth matching my rolls? Or worse, what if I was charged for some terrible mutilation or murder? I wrapped the sheets into a bowl and quickly dressed. I lugged the stained bedding to the dumpsters and tossed it all in with a dull thud. I checked the mailbox on my way back in, and within the mailbox, atop the junk mail and envelopes stamped past due, 6 bills were stacked. 6 perfectly flat, fresh off the press, $100 bills. I glanced at each side, making sure nobody was watching, before stuffing them into my pocket and returning indoors. I was conflicted. I knew that these teeth had to have come from someone. Someone, somewhere, unwillingly must have had them removed, but as far as the actual evidence went, there was nothing solid to prove it. I had culpable deniability. I won't say it wasn't greedy, but I did what you most likely would have done had you been in my shoes. I continued rolling those dice. I cast the die every day that week. One day I got snake eyes, 2 bloody circles glaring up at me from those carved bone cubes. The next day I rolled a 5 and a 2, 7. Each number would coincide with the number of teeth and the number of $100 bills I would find in my mailbox. With each day passed, my bank account increased, and I was able to chip away at my debts. But the state of those teeth appeared progressively more forceful in their extraction. The teeth under my pillow contained more meat, more gum tissue, nerves, and soon even chips of bone with each consecutive day. As the week reached an end, I rolled a 10. And when I woke up, I found 10 teeth under my pillow, just not as I had expected. There were 10 of them snugly set in their corresponding sockets of gum in a red skinless human lower jaw. The pillow and sheets were soaked through with blood, the mattress too. Whoever's jaw this belonged to was likely dead. And recently so. I swore I was finished, then and there. I fetched my mail, retrieving the $1,000 cash, and sobbed at the disturbing reality of the situation. But there was something else too. A small endorphin rush had occurred so subtly each time I picked up the die. It was like a drug. I made it 3 days without touching those damned dice, and in those days I felt withdrawal symptoms. I was shivering and scratching incessantly. I couldn't stop shaking, and my body was racked with the most serious aches I had ever felt. I knew I had to roll them, there was no fighting it. I used some of the money to set up a camera on my desktop to monitor my bedroom during the night. I finally picked up that pair of dice again, and I immediately felt my ailing body return to normal. A sweeping euphoria unlike any I'd experienced rushed into my previously aching body. A bliss graced me when I tossed them, a floating warmth that hugged me, welcoming me back. There was no doubt in my mind then that this physical dependency was real. I looked down at the 2 numbers staring up at me from those red holes in the bone dice. I'd rolled a pair of 6s, 12. That night I slept more soundly than I ever had before. Before I looked under my pillow that morning I felt a cold wave of fear, dreading what I might find. I just knew something worse was waiting there for me. When I worked up the courage to lift the pillow, I was right. There were 10 severed human fingers under the pillow, crudely hacked from just above the knuckle. There was so much blood it was trickling down the side of my mattress. Among the mess of bloody digits were 2 glistening orbs trailing braids of muscle. 2 human eyes, staring up at me. I screamed. I watched the footage. It's just me sleeping until 3:33 AM when my head flat against the pillow raises slightly before lowering back down. Nothing else. Nobody came in or out of my room. Any part of my mind that shut out spirituality or religion finally caved in. Something very dark was at play, and I wanted nothing to do with it. I needed to get rid of the die. After again hauling the disturbing mess of my bedding to the bin, I placed the pair of dice back into that ornately carved wooden box, careful not to disturb the numbers. I carried it out to my backyard, and with my shovel, I dug a hole 4 feet deep. I placed the box down within, then shoveled dirt on top, until it was no longer visible. I patted it down hard with the flat blade to compact the soil, and I even dispersed grass over top, to make sure it was hard to identify where those awful dice were buried. I didn't trust myself to not dig them up again. I prayed it was the end of it. I cried myself to sleep that night. But it was over. And that brings me to this morning, 2 days of vomiting, and the shakes later. I woke up today with an excruciating sting in my jaws. I winced with pain as I peeled my sticky face off of my pillow, which was soaked through with dried blood. I staggered to the bathroom and looked into the mirror with shock and disgust. My whole face was caked red, the coppery taste of my blood both bitter and pungent. I opened my aching mouth to see the raw mess of red jelly in empty sockets where 4 of my teeth had been removed. I panicked, looking around my apartment, but found no sign of an intruder. I watched the recording, seeing nothing but my head shaking with a few violent jerks before the pillow began staining red. I scrambled into my clothes and ran outside into the yard. I walked over to the plot of land I'd buried those damn dice under and stood there with a rapidly beating heart, my stinging jaw agape. The wind stung my exposed sockets and torn gums as I looked at the disrupted earth and empty earthen hole. The box of dice was gone. Then the revelation hit me like a pail of ice water. It was someone else's turn to roll them now.